The Valley of Isdalen does not welcome visitors. It is a jagged, narrow throat of stone carved into the Norwegian landscape, where the mist clings to the rock faces like a shroud that refuses to lift. Even in the height of the day, the light here is thin and gray, filtered through a damp, biting chill that seeps through the thickest layers of wool. It is November 1970. The air is heavy, tasting of wet granite and ancient, undisturbed moss. There is a silence in this gorge that feels deliberate, a static, pressurized quiet that seems to hold its breath. Nothing moves here unless the wind forces it. No birds call from the high ridges, no water trickles down the slopes. It is a place where time has stalled, trapped between the towering, impassive walls of the gorge. For anyone standing on the floor of this valley, the world outside feels like a distant memory. The ground is littered with loose shale that shifts underfoot with a sharp, metallic crunch. Something is hidden in the shadows, waiting for the mist to clear. A hiker pushed through the dense, low-hanging fog, boots sliding on the slick, moss-covered shale. He stopped. The rhythm of his breathing hitched, then stalled. Near a cluster of jagged boulders, the gray landscape broke. A form lay sprawled against the stone, partially obscured by the shifting mist. It was a woman. She did not belong to the harsh, vertical geometry of the gorge. Her position was not that of a climber who had slipped or a traveler who had succumbed to the elements. The scene held a jarring, unnatural stillness. Her limbs were angled in a way that spoke of a sudden, violent cessation of movement. There was no gear nearby, no pack, no map, no sign of a struggle against the terrain itself. Just the body, anchored to the cold earth in a place where no local would venture, especially not in the biting freeze of November. The hiker stepped closer, his own movements cautious, almost reverent. Authorities arrived within hours, their heavy boots crunching rhythmically against the shale. They moved with clinical efficiency, circling the site, their flashlights cutting through the gloom. They searched the immediate vicinity, turning over rocks and scouring the crevices, expecting to find the standard debris of a traveler, a wallet, a passport, a discarded train ticket. They found nothing. The pockets were empty. There were no rings on her fingers, no watch on her wrist, no scrap of paper tucked into a seam. She was a woman stripped of every conventional marker of existence. The investigators stood back, their breath blooming in the frigid air, staring at the void where a life should have left its footprint. She was not merely a victim of the valley. She was a blank slate. Every detail that usually anchors a person to the world, a name, a home, a history, had been meticulously scrubbed away. She existed in the present moment, yet she possessed no past. She was a ghost in the machinery of modern Europe, a human entity without a name or origin. As the realization settled over the team, the investigation shifted. This was not a simple case of a lost traveler. This was the quiet, methodical erasure of an identity. She was the Isdal Woman, and she had arrived in this gorge as if she had never existed at all. The investigation moved from the damp rocks of Isdalen to the sterile, fluorescent-lit offices of the Bergen police. Detectives began the slow, grueling task of reconstructing a life that had been designed to be invisible. They combed through police reports, missing persons files, and international databases, expecting to find a thread to pull. Instead, they hit a wall of calculated silence. Every lead they followed revealed a pattern of extreme, professional precision. She did not leave a trail. She left a series of carefully constructed masks. Investigators tracked her movements across the continent, noting how she navigated cities with the practiced ease of someone who knew exactly how to avoid detection. She never stayed long enough to be remembered, yet she was always noticed. She possessed an unplaceable accent that shifted depending on the listener. The detectives realized they were not looking for a woman who had lost her way, but for someone who had mastered the art of being lost on purpose. She was a professional, and she had spent her life ensuring that no one would ever truly know her. The investigation turned to the hotel registries of Bergen and Oslo. Detectives pulled hundreds of registration cards, their eyes scanning the ink for a consistent hand. They found her, but she was never the same person twice. In one hotel, she was Fenella Lork. In another, she signed as Claudia Tielt. The names changed with the city, a rotating collection of aliases that defied any logical pattern. Investigators laid the cards side by side on a long wooden table. The handwriting was identical. The same sharp, deliberate loops, the same pressure of the pen, but the identities were fabrications. She checked into luxury suites and modest inns with equal ease, always paying in cash, always requesting rooms with a view of the exit. The pattern was undeniable. She was not merely moving through these cities, she was curating her presence within them. Each registration card was a calculated move. She left behind a trail of paper that was meant to lead nowhere, a labyrinth of fake names designed to exhaust the patience of any pursuer. The detectives traced her path from the coastal hotels of Bergen to the bustling centers of Oslo, watching as she shed one name after another like a snake shedding skin. Those who encountered her in the lobbies and dining rooms of Bergen remembered her with a strange, lingering clarity. She was elegant, moving through crowded spaces with a poise that made others instinctively step aside. She sat at tables alone, back straight, eyes scanning the room with a calm, predatory vigilance. When she spoke to staff, her voice was low and measured. It was the accent that unsettled them most. It carried the cadence of a dozen different regions, yet belonged to none. It was a linguistic chameleon, shifting just enough to prevent anyone from guessing her home. She never shared personal details, never lingered in conversation, and never allowed a moment of genuine intimacy. If a waiter asked where she was from, she would simply smile, a polite, closed expression that ended the exchange immediately. She was a ghost in the machinery of the city, perfectly composed, perfectly detached, and utterly impossible to place. The trail of aliases ended abruptly at the Bergen railway station. In the depths of the lost and found office, 2 suitcases sat waiting, unclaimed and gathering dust. When investigators finally secured the warrants to open them, the nature of the mystery underwent a violent shift. These were not the bags of a tourist or a transient. They were the portable archives of a life built on absolute secrecy. The locks clicked open, and the contents spilled out under the harsh glare of the station lights. There were no personal mementos, no photographs, no letters from home, and no diaries to offer a glimpse into her past. Instead, the cases were filled with the calculated necessities of a ghost. Every item had been curated for utility and anonymity. The investigators moved through the contents with growing unease, realizing that the woman they had been tracking through hotel registries was far more dangerous than they had imagined. The luggage did not reveal a person. It revealed a system. It was the equipment of someone who understood the mechanics of surveillance. The investigators turned their attention to the garments packed within the cases. They lifted a heavy coat, shaking it out under the light, but the interior was unnervingly bare. Every seam where a manufacturer tag should have been was empty. They reached for a pair of trousers, then a blouse, checking the collars and the waistbands. Nothing. Every single label had been meticulously cut away. It was not a haphazard job done in haste. It was a surgical, systematic destruction. The threads were snipped with precision, leaving no trace of a brand, a size, or a country of origin. They laid the items out on the table, a collection of high-quality materials that now held no history. By removing the labels, she had effectively severed the connection to every shop, every warehouse, and every tailor that had touched her life. The detectives used magnifying glasses to scan the fabric, looking for the tiny, telltale remnants of a stitch, but found only clean, empty space. This was a deliberate act of erasure, a refusal to be traced back to a source. Beneath the layers of anonymous fabric, the investigators unearthed a small, weathered notebook. It was tucked into a side pocket, easily overlooked, yet it held more weight than all the garments combined. They opened it to find pages filled with dense, handwritten sequences. These were not random scribbles or grocery lists. They were precise strings of numbers, dates, and geographic coordinates, written in a tight, disciplined hand. The lead investigator traced the ink with a gloved finger, noting the recurring patterns. Each entry seemed to correspond to a specific city, a hotel, and a date of arrival. It was a logbook of her movements across Europe, but it was written in a private, impenetrable code. The numbers were not merely dates. They were markers in a rigid, calculated schedule that governed every aspect of her existence. She was not wandering. She was following a map that only she could read. The detective spent hours cross-referencing the sequences against known transit routes, but the logic remained elusive. It was a system designed to be understood only by the person who authored it. The notebook did not exist in a vacuum. Outside the walls of the investigation room, the Europe of 1970 was a landscape defined by invisible borders and high-stakes surveillance. Intelligence services operated in the dark, maintaining vast, interlocking networks of couriers and anonymous operatives. The investigators began to overlay her documented movements onto maps of known Cold War transit corridors. The patterns aligned with chilling precision. She moved through cities that served as hubs for clandestine activity, always arriving just before key diplomatic events or sensitive political shifts. The air in the office grew heavy with the weight of this realization. This was not the itinerary of a tourist or a business traveler. It was the movement of a ghost, integrated into a machine of state-level espionage. Every hotel she checked into, every train she boarded, was part of a theater where silence was the primary currency. She was not merely hiding from a person. She was navigating a world where being known was a fatal error. She was a figure of profound suspicion, a ghost moving through a continent held in the grip of a silent, global standoff. The questions in the file grew sharper as the investigation deepened. Was she an intelligence operative, a highly trained asset moving through the dark, or perhaps a courier, tasked with carrying information too sensitive for radio or wire? The third possibility felt the most visceral. A woman fleeing a past so dangerous that she had to invent a new self for every city she entered. The detectives tracked her habits through witness statements. She was perpetually alert. She checked mirrors before entering rooms. She memorized every exit in every hotel lobby. She lived with the quiet, crushing isolation of someone who knew that being recognized meant the end. She stood as a figure of profound suspicion, yet the evidence remained ambiguous. Was she the hunter or the hunted? She moved through the world with the precision of a professional, yet her eyes betrayed a constant, scanning vigilance. She was a ghost in the machinery of Europe, and the secret she carried was clearly worth the total erasure of her own existence. The investigators turned their focus to the paper trail, hoping to find a single point of origin. They started with the names on the hotel registration cards. Each one was a dead end. They contacted the addresses provided, only to find empty lots, abandoned buildings, or names that did not exist in any registry. The trail was not merely cold, it was designed to dissolve. Every lead they pursued acted like a mirror, reflecting only their own questions back at them. They cross-referenced her aliases against international databases, but the results were consistently empty. It became clear that she had not just traveled, she had systematically scrubbed her presence from the record. The detectives reached out to authorities in other cities, hoping for a breakthrough, but the response was always the same. No record, no history, no trace. She had not left a trail behind her. She had constructed a labyrinth of false exits, ensuring that anyone following her would eventually lose their way in the dark. The witnesses who encountered her in those final months painted a picture of a woman living in a state of constant, high-stakes alertness. Hotel staff in Bergen and Oslo recalled a guest who was never truly at rest. She did not walk through lobbies. She navigated them. She would pause at the threshold, eyes scanning the room before she stepped inside. She checked the mirrors in the hallways, not for vanity, but to see who was behind her. She memorized the location of every service exit and every fire stair. When she sat in a restaurant, she chose the table that offered the widest view of the room and the closest path to the door. She maintained a distance that was both polite and impenetrable, ensuring that no conversation could ever turn personal. She lived with the quiet, crushing isolation of someone who knew that a single slip, a single moment of vulnerability could be fatal. She was always watching, always calculating the distance between herself and the nearest shadow. This was not the behavior of a traveler. It was the behavior of a person who had turned her entire life into a defensive perimeter. She was a woman who mastered the art of being unreachable. The movement stopped in the valley of Isdalen. This remote, rocky gorge, hidden away from the transit hubs of Europe, became the final point on her map. The transition from a life of constant motion to the absolute stillness of the valley floor was abrupt and final. Investigators stood in the damp, thin air, looking at the site where she was found, and the question shifted from how she lived to why she had chosen this specific, desolate place. It was not a location one stumbled upon by accident. It was a site that required intent, a destination that demanded a difficult climb through unforgiving terrain. Was she waiting for someone to emerge from the mist, or was she running from a shadow that had finally caught up to her? The silence of the gorge offered no answers. The rocks held no echoes of a conversation or a struggle. She had arrived here with a purpose, yet that purpose died with her, leaving behind only the biting cold, and the unanswered query of her presence. The valley became a tomb, but it also became a question that refused to settle. Every search of the surrounding slopes only deepened the mystery, as the geography itself seemed to conspire against the truth. Decades after the valley fell silent, the mystery moved from the morgue to the laboratory. Scientists applied the full weight of modern forensic technology to the remains, seeking a name in the isotopes of her teeth and the sequence of her DNA. They mapped her biological history, tracing the chemical signatures of her childhood and the regions where she had spent her final years. The data was precise, the analysis exhaustive, yet the results hit a wall of absolute negation. The databases remained empty. No match appeared in the global records. No family line emerged from the genetic archives. It was as if she had been born into the world fully formed, without a history, without a lineage, and without a point of origin. Her erasure was not merely a matter of cut labels or fake names. It was a total systemic disappearance. Every attempt to bridge the gap between the physical evidence and a human identity failed, proving that her life had been constructed to withstand even the scrutiny of the future. She remained devoid in the record. She exists now as a permanent fracture in the foundation of reality. In an era defined by the relentless accumulation of data, where every transaction, movement, and digital footprint is captured and archived, she stands as the ultimate counterproof. She lived, she breathed, she traversed borders and occupied rooms, yet she left no tether to the world of the living. She is not merely a woman whose name was lost. She's a person who successfully navigated the machinery of society while remaining entirely unrecorded. This is the core of the unease she leaves behind. She represents the terrifying possibility that one can inhabit the world without being part of it, moving through the crowd like a phantom. She is a crack in the system, a human ghost who defied the modern obsession with identity and documentation. While the world demands a label, a history, and a place in the ledger, she offers only silence. She remains a living, breathing paradox, a person who was undeniably present, yet whose true self was never captured by the record. She is the embodiment of the fear that a life can be lived, concluded, and erased. The mist that clings to the rocks of Isdalen acts as a shroud that never lifts. She is held here, not by stone, but by the weight of the questions she carried into the earth. She exists in the space between the woman who walked into the gorge and the silence that claimed her. There is no transition from her life to her death, only a sudden, absolute cessation of movement. She remains suspended, a phantom presence in the thin, freezing air of the valley. Every gust of wind through the crags feels like an echo of her passage, yet the landscape offers no answers. She is a human ghost, caught in the stillness of a place that has become her only monument. The world outside continues to turn, documenting every heartbeat and transaction, but here, time has stopped at the moment of her erasure. She is neither fully gone nor truly remembered, trapped in the liminal state of a story that refuses to be finished. The valley guards her secret with a cold, indifferent patience, keeping her suspended in the silence, forever separated from the identity she discarded and the life she once lived. Her story triggers a primal, shivering dread, the fear of becoming entirely unknowable. We build our lives on the assumption that we leave a ripple, a mark, a name that survives the final breath. She proves that this is a fragile illusion. She did not just die. She dismantled herself, piece by piece, until there was nothing left for the world to claim. This was not a failure of investigation, but a triumph of disappearance. It forces a terrifying question upon anyone who looks at her case. What secret could be so heavy, so dangerous, that it necessitated the total destruction of one's own existence? She represents the ultimate nightmare of the individual. The prospect of dying with one's true story permanently incinerated. There is no comfort in her silence, only the cold realization that she chose to be a blank slate. She walked away from her own history, leaving behind only the void. The mist settles now, heavy and gray, sealing the gorge of Isdalen in a final, suffocating embrace. It clings to the jagged rock faces, smoothing over the sharp edges of the terrain where she once stood. There is no resolution here, only the quiet, unrelenting persistence of the cold. The valley keeps what it was given. She remains a flicker of shadow in the history of a continent, a name that was never hers, and a life that left no footprint. As the light fades from the gorge, the wind carries no answers, only the chill of an unresolved ending. The secret remains buried. Who was she? And what truth was so vital that she carried it into the dark? The mist does not lift, the silence does not break,